It is picking up some comments and it's picking up me. And there's no reason to think that's going to change because mics are not very effective, nor should they be. Alright, today's Hamlet. The most written about work of literature in Western culture or in any culture. That's not regarding the Bible as literature, which is not fair, it is literature. Most books published in the West are on the Bible, or at least the Christian Bible, the New Testament. After that, a long way behind comes Shakespeare, who's a long way ahead of anything else in terms of published books. And the same would be true of articles and anything else. By far the most written about work of Shakespeare's is Hamlet. Virtually all literary critics would agree Hamlet's the central work, probably the most influential writer, literary writer in the Western tradition. And knocking your shines, eh? Sorry. We're studying culture here. Anything that retains interest as long and as widely as Hamlet raises the question why. There must be something in this play, or a number of things in this play, that somehow hit a nerve, that address questions, issues, anxieties, big factor, in a way that virtually nothing else does. I mean, it just wouldn't. We'd lose interest, especially something that's 400 years old, over 400 years old. It's difficult language, especially today in television and texting culture. Shakespeare has a huge vocabulary, 30,000 working words. He's very inventive with English. He created phrases and expressions. This is nowhere more true than in this play. In many ways, it's his most difficult play. It's certainly not his best. You couldn't say this is his best structured work. It wanders all over the place, as you know. And you wonder why some scenes, like fighting Norwegians on the ice, or what they're doing in there, what their relevance is. The play might be better if they were scrapped. So it's not a great work because of its perfect structure. I think if you think of Jane Austen and Pride and Prejudice, her most popular novel, that's a beautifully structured work. Hamlet is not. Not easy, especially today. It's not just in university English departments that it's taken seriously. As I mentioned last week, new film of Hamlet comes out virtually every 5 years, and usually does pretty well at the box office. So it's also strange. So our single interest today is what is going on in Hamlet, and why this play, why this work. It's got side virtues, some beautiful language, some powerful speeches. Some of the To Be or Not to Be is the most famous speech in the English language. There's that sort of thing, virtuoso writing, but that is not nearly, for students of culture like us, that is not nearly enough to explain the power of this play. Well, let me start off with a question. I'll do this with a number of the stories that we're looking at. Come in. So we've got seats today. We'll do this with a number of works we look at. Let's say we've been given $200 million to make a film of Hamlet. Another film of Hamlet, us collectively in this room. But the one instruction is you can't call it Hamlet. What would you call it? What title would you give to the film?
The Prince of Denmark.
Prince of Denmark, that's very weak. that wouldn't fill the box office.
To Be or Not to Be.
To Be or Not to Be, okay. A being. To Be or Not to Be. It's not bad, is it? To Be or Not to Be.
How are we making it? Are we making it as like a period to Hamlet? Or are we making it as a...
Yeah, that's up for discussion.
That
That's
would-
up for discussion.
Are we going to Baz Luhrmann the Hamlet?
But I was thinking the Macbeth they made in Australia, like it was like underbelly style.
Oh, we could do that. We'll do anything's possible. We've been given a lot of money, and we've only got one instruction. We can't call it Hamlet. So we've got to be or not to be. And we're not doing a bad, that's my input. We're not doing a Baz Luhrmann style. Great Gatsby. It's half-wrecked a great novel. It's not going to be that style, half-wrecked. Great play.
The Prince of Procrastination.
All right, pretty good. The Prince of Procrastination. Maybe it's a bit wordy for a film.
That sounds like a really bad teen movie.
Prince of Procrastination. Good, might remember that though. To be or not to be, the Prince of Procrastination. What else? I think if anyone gets the title and the title plays a big role in selling this film, they should get a bonus out of this $200 million.
25%.
Yeah, got 5%. It's like the newspaper headlines who write the headlines in the newspapers. They get best paid in the newspaper.
Deception?
Deception, okay. One word. The original title, Hamlet's one word. Deception. Any other? One word.
Revenge.
Revenge. Deception, revenge. To be or not to be. Procrastination. Any other themes?
Conscious mind.
The conscious mind.
Is very subconscious mind.
The self-conscious or
Yeah.
conscious?
Self-conscious it is, but
The self-conscious mind. Self-conscious mind. Was that from the Wonderful Mind? What is that? Beautiful Mind. I don't think you call that a beautiful mind. No? No one else? Ego. Hamlet's ego?
Maybe everyone's.
Ego. Not bad. Ego. Is Hamlet full of himself? No. Not clear. Yes. No one else? No Freudian titles?
Well, sex is a big theme, but you can't call maybe just sex.
Because, well, you could. Sex? Incest? You can get more specific.
Everyone dies.
to put Guy Ritchie in the title.
Everyone dies. Not bad. There's the death theme. Anyone else? What do you remember most strongly, or what's most striking? And this is reading stories. It's often good after you've got to know it. Half close your eyes and think what's most striking.
It's not. It's all about revenge, isn't it? Enjoying
Well, that's the question. I mean, tens of thousands of people have written about what's it all about. We've got revenge as one title.
Passion.
Passion or lack of passion. One of Hamlet's complaints about himself is he lacks passion.
The Father, the Son, and the Ghost.
The Father, the Son, and the Ghost. That's a good one. Play on Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. The Father, the Son, and the Ghost.
Pouring poison in ears.
Very blunt. Very blunt.
But that's the scene that really sticks in my head.
Mother, Son, and Ghost might be better.
Yeah.
What about what's nobler in the mind?
There's a question mark. What's nobler in the mind? It's not bad, is it? Because there's a sort of enigma. There's a sort of enigma. It's quite good to have a... Is it about nobility, the play? Sort of.
Sort of, yeah.
Sort of. That's one of the things with Hamlet. You sort of sort of start to come on a lot of things. And things about revenge, maybe, sort of.
There's a lot of contradictions in it. Sort of, it's partly about this, but then it's sort of not as well. And
Well, our job in 3 hours is to resolve all of those contradictions. And we'll get a long way in doing that, I hope. That'll be my ambition anyway.
And you're just going to write it down and get all the credit for it?
Who, me? All right, we've got quite a few titles. If you took, the play's obviously about Hamlet, that's unambiguous. This is a story which is, the main figure is the main figure and he's the main interest. That's not really up for discussion.
But not just that, it's his father's name as well. So it's about avenging him.
His father's called Hamlet. There's Hamlet and Hamlet. You like the revenge theme, don't you?
I do.
Hamlet can tend to make one very personal in terms of, that's the way I see this. I'm not denying, by the way, revenge is important. There wouldn't have been so much written on it if it wasn't possible to interpret it in hundreds of ways. I hope we'll reach a few convincing interpretations this morning. If you took Hamlet to a modern counsellor or psychotherapist, what would he be diagnosed as? Psychological diagnosis.
suffering from depression.
Depression. I think that's right, isn't it? What are the...
PTSD.
Pardon?
PTSD, possibly multiple personality.
G...
Post-traumatic stress disorder.
Maybe. We don't know that he hasn't always been like this.
Bipolar, probably, because he's a bit manic as well. So he gets depressed, but then he gets...
Manic, so we're sharpening the diagnosis to manic depression. When's he manic?
With his mom.
When he's playing the fool, pretending to be...
You mean when he's attacking his mother? Although he keeps telling himself, I need to speak daggers, but I can't. I mean, he's sort of a bit flat and almost depressed in relationship to his mother too.
With Rosencrantz and Guildenstern.
Well, he's practical there, isn't he? I wouldn't say he's manic, he's practical.
Oh, when he's sort of playing the fool and he's, like...
He's not manic though.
But I'd put him as a multiple personality disorder.
A multiple?
Yeah, because he's like the idea of the ghost father. If you accept that as not an actual part, that's him talking to himself about this.
Okay, this is getting very sophisticated. The ghost is not a real ghost, it's part of Hamlet's mind.
No,
which
but
is
Horatio's seen the ghost.
Yeah.
So therefore he doesn't
ghost.
exist.
Yeah, that makes that's true. Makes that a hard... Really
At least in one
sustain.
scene anyway, maybe.
Yeah.
maybe
Well,
it
the start
does.
of the army start to see him, but like in the same sense.
Well, let's keep multiple personalities. I've never heard that reading of Hamlet. Maybe we can come back to that. We learn a lot through his soliloquies or his monologues. And Hamlet speaks a lot. He talks a lot. His first one, and it's almost typical, is all about how sterile life is. I mean, it's a very sort of depressive view of the first soliloquy. Let's have a look. 140 odd. How weary, stale, flat and unprofitable seem to me all the uses of this world. How weary, stale, flat and unprofitable seem to me all the uses of this world. Fie on fie, 'tis an unweeded garden that grows to seed. Things rank and gross in nature, and so on. It's quite typical of humans, of this quintessence of dust. A very sort of pessimistic, depressed, melancholy view of the human condition.
And he even talks about committing suicide in there because he says, that the everlasting had not fixed his cannon against self-slaughter. So he's saying life's so depressing that if only we could just kill
Don't have to
ourselves
kill
and end
myself.
it. Yeah.
There's a lot about suicide throughout. A lot about suicide. There's more. Let's see down the back. also obviously depressive, melancholy, depressive thing. Thinking I could kill myself. I mean, he's lost interest in life and hope and ambition that I wish I could end it. I think that's pretty uncontroversial, isn't it? That Hamlet is quite profoundly depressed. It's an open question as to the obvious cause is the death of his father, but maybe it's more profound than just the death of his father. We sort of don't really. We don't have any descriptions of Hamlet before the death of his father, where he was a sort of cheerful, active, dynamic, undepressed individual. We don't know. All right, the Hamlet question, as it's often called. What's the problem? The problem in this play, the question that almost everyone who writes on the play tries to answer. What's the Hamlet problem? What's Hamlet's problem?
His conscience.
Yeah, but specifically, why does his conscience? What does his conscience produce that is a problem?
Doubt.
Doubt.
Yeah.
Doubt about
whether potentially killing someone is the right thing to do. And
kill Claudius.
yeah.
And whether he can trust the ghost, whether the ghost is really the ghost of his father, or whether it's a demon trying to tempt him into doing something.
Does he talk in those terms, that the ghost might be a fiction?
Yeah.
He does at one point.
Yeah.
Well, not a fiction necessarily, but a demon.
Mine others have seen the ghost. I mean, the procrastinating line, I mean, how sure is Hamlet that Claudius has killed his father? Horatio is sure, and Horatio's Hamlet's friend, and Horatio's praised throughout the play as being the balanced, rational person. And he says right at the start, you don't need a ghost to tell you what's happened.
He wants certainty.
Pardon?
I think Hamlet is procrastinating because he wants certainty, and he knows about the certainty of his actions. I think that's why he hesitates.
So you're giving a reason for why he procrastinates.
Yeah, maybe.
Because he's uncertain. That's the doubt thing.
And you've got to think, like, back then religion was pretty big, and there was an element of not, wanting to go to hell for doing the wrong thing.
Does he say that? Has he got is he worried about committing murder?
Well, he doesn't exactly, but he does talk about how when he doesn't want to kill Claudius when he's praying because he'll go to heaven. So there is a heaven and hell playing a part.
So Claudius doesn't go to heaven.
Yeah, exactly.
Hamlet's not saying, I'm going to go to hell if I kill Claudius. Is Hamlet worried about having blood on his hands? No.
It's more about what's the more noble or the right thing to do. Again, to be or not to be soliloquy, he talks a lot about, death being the undiscovered country and what dreams may come when you shuffle off the mortal coil. But it starts off with him saying whether it is no good in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. It's kind of like Socrates and Ethan again. Which way am I going to go here?
Although their speech is basically about suicide. Why don't I kill myself? Rather than... So the procrastination is all about killing Claudius. Hamlet's one of his appealing sides is he's very intelligent. He's very insightful into the motives of others. He sees through Rosencrantz and Guildenstern straight away. He's very insightful. And he talks endlessly about his view of himself and his own motives or lack of motives. And what's his own reading of his procrastination? His own main reading of his procrastination, that he keeps delaying and delaying and delaying killing Claudius. I mean, the Hamlet problem is, why doesn't he kill Claudius?
I think he overthinks it all.
He
Gets so
overthinks.
bogged down in thinking about, looking at all the different aspects of it. And
What does he say himself, though, about himself as his reason? What's the problem? His main, he says again and again and again about himself, his main weakness in his own eyes.
But he lacks courage, but I am pigeon-livered and lack gall.
Lack courage, lacks passion. Like he gets the players perform a play, he admires the leading players, the player works up huge passion over some imaginary drama that means nothing, whereas here Hamlet, who's got a real reason for passion, he doesn't, it's sort of not there. At that point he's asking, where's my passion? He admires men of action. He admires Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, figures who do things, like Ethan. He would admire Ethan. Because I, Hamlet, lack the passion to do it, to kill Claudius. And he doesn't say it's my conscience of thou shalt not kill. And he quite happily sends Rosencrantz and Guildenstern to their deaths without a blink. He has any sort of Christian or moral reading that Hamlet is squeamish about killing is just complete. It's quite clear in the play that's not Hamlet.
And
he kills Polonius through the curtain. Polonius is completely innocent, and Hamlet feels no remorse. He has no bad conscience about killing Polonius. So he's not worried about killing. That's not the reason he can't act.
It's not moral. It's not a moral dilemma.
It's not a moral dilemma about thou shalt not kill, no. It's not, thou shalt not kill is not sitting over Hamlet's head, stopping him. That's not the issue. And he's not squeamish about killing. We can see that. He sends Rosencrantz and Guildenstern to their deaths. He kills Polonius. He admires men of action, the Alexander the Greats, the Julius Caesars. Who else does he?
Fortinbras?
Fortinbras, yes, he admires Fortinbras, who's a real king, man of action, warrior, fighting over some useless bit of ice.
That's the turning point for him, isn't it, where he says, now all my thoughts will be bloody. With this guy's passionate about a piece of ice.
Yeah.
And I have a reason to be passionate and I'm not.
Exactly. Again, Hamlet's asking about myself, well, why? I mean, how come he's got all this passion about nothing and I've got a real cause for revenging my father's death, and yet I can't act.
But I think Hamlet sort of represents the thinking man. Like he just thinks about it so much, like as I said before, he overthinks it. And it's you've got the two schools sort of thought. You've got the man of action who will just go and do something, and then you've got the sort of the Renaissance man who's the thinker and will think it, but to the point where he over-examines everything and can't take action because he gets so bogged down in all the.
Although his thinking leads him to the point where I should kill Claudius.
Yeah.
It's not doubt. By halfway through the play, it's not doubt that's stopping it.
True.
It's his will. His passion, his will. And he keeps finding new reasons or new tests. Like the players, at the end of the play, it's pretty clear from Claudius' reaction to the play that Claudius is guilty. And Hamlet finds plenty of evidence that Claudius is guilty, as the ghost is told him. Hamlet trusts the ghost, predominantly. The ghost's account of his father being poisoned through the ear. And yet, for some reason, he can't do it. He can't act. He can't kill. He's very close to his mother. He's got another reason, revenging, he's almost hysterical about his mother sleeping with Claudius. We'll come to that a bit later. Another reason for killing Claudius. So that's the question, why can't he move? It's his question about himself. I mean, certainly one answer is conscience does make cowards of us all. Famous line, to be or not to be speech. Thinking paralyses. But that might be rationalisation. That might be that he's paralysed by something else, and then he just says, "Oh well." We always find excuses. If we have a bad conscience about something we've done or can't or should do, we often find excusing reasons, rationalisations, and that could be a Hamlet rationalisation. Do we Is anyone familiar with the Freudian reading of Hamlet? There's one. Freud almost called the Oedipus complex the Hamlet complex. No?
I understand where it's coming from, but I haven't read it.
Where's it coming from? What's your hunch?
Well, the connected basic Freudian is that he's in love with his mother,
Yeah,
and
it's not his mother.
therefore he is jealous of any other man who wants to be with his mother.
Yep. Part of the reading is in love with his mother, is jealous of any other father, uncle. He's in love with his mother. How old's Hamlet?
30.
30. So he's not, 17-year-old. 30, about the same age as Jesus. It's quite a common. Gatsby, have you seen the film or read Gatsby? He's about 30. Gatsby in some ways is a reworking of Hamlet. Great Gatsby. Alright, I'll outline the Freudian case about Hamlet. Freud stresses that a lot of neurosis or damaged character comes from relations in early childhood with parents, two parents. And Hamlet himself is as classic a case of the Oedipal complex as Oedipus in Greek tragedy was. He is there's plenty of evidence in the play he's pathologically close to his mother. I mean, he's obsessed about his very virulent imagery about her having sex with Claudius. It's a bit like being in a pigsty. If you just read the language, there's passion here. I'll just give you one example. This is speaking to his mother, Act 3, Scene 4. Nay, but to live in the rank sweat of an enseamed bed, stewed in corruption, honeying and making love over the nasty sky. In his own imagination, his mother making love with Claudius is just filthy, revolting, disgusting, the most reprehensible, nasty. So that's at his 30. He should be way past thinking about his mother in these terms. Claudius says at one point his mother lives by his looks, so there's really great closeness of Hamlet and mother. The Oedipus, you're not familiar with Oedipus. Greek tragedy by Sophocles. Oedipus kills his father, marries his mother, and has 4 children with his mother. Hamlet then is the classical for Freud Oedipal complex when his father's alive. He wants to kill his father and marry his mother. What happens in the story is Claudius comes along and kills his father. Claudius, in other words, does what Hamlet in his deep unconscious mind really wanted to do, kill his father, replace his father. So there's identification. Claudius is sort of Hamlet himself. One of the reasons, psychological reason that Hamlet can't kill Claudius is he'd be killing himself. It's still unconscious. Freud's reading, it's all unconscious. So there's sort of Hamlet himself is not aware of this, in other words. But he's sort of paralysed in relationship to Claudius because Claudius has sort of enacted his own deepest wish to kill his father and replace him. So there's an sort of profound inhibition in relationship to Claudius, but there's also equally important an incestuous attachment to his mother. Another son, in this case, which also brings with it a huge amount of guilt. You can imagine, especially the males in the room. If anyone told you this about your relations with your mother, you'd shock horror and And actually, if there was some truth to it, you feel terrible, you feel guilty. The Freudian reading of Hamlet is he's got a sort of two-edged paralysis. One, out of inhibition of killing Claudius, because Claudius is himself. And two, out of guilt of his relations, of his sexual attachment to his mother. Now, those of you not familiar with Freudian psychology, most of modern counselling is sort of neo-Freudian, it's in this tradition, are saying, well, it's just ridiculous that sons want to kill their fathers and marry their mothers. There are plenty of real-life cases. And the great sociologist Max Weber was pitched into chronic depression for 5 years after the death of his father. This is, read the biographies of Max Weber. The last time he saw his father, he'd ordered his father out of... Weber was very close to his mother. The last time he saw his father, he ordered his father out of his own house, Max Weber's house, in a rage. The last act was sort of violent rage against his father. 6 months later, his father dies. Depression, his depression, and looks pretty plausible readings linked to guilt over the death of his father. It's as if I killed my father, because he didn't. He didn't literally kill his father, but it's as if I killed my father. Now, there are lots of stories of family dramas that don't fit this model. I'm certainly not suggesting you apply this everywhere, but Oedipus, Hamlet, Max Weber, and there are others where it fits quite significantly. The argument continues, Freud's argument continues. What Shakespeare does quite brilliantly splits the father in three in the play. There's the good father, who's the dead father, Hamlet's father Hamlet. There's the bad father, Claudius, and there's the senile father, Polonius. And Hamlet displaces his desire to kill father. He hasn't killed his real father, can't kill Claudius. He displaces it onto the senile father, the innocent one, who kills Polonius. He actually does kill a father figure, but it's not the... And that's the sort of classic displacement out of guilt.
Doesn't he not know that it's Polonius?
No, he doesn't, and he thinks he might think it's Claudius. No, but in reading this, the reality, in truth, what we're reading, what actually happens, although irrationally it's true because he doesn't know who's behind the curtain. Significantly, it's the third father. Now, children's fairy tales do a similar thing with mothers. There's the good mother and there's the wicked witch. The mother gets split into a purely good figure, a purely evil figure. Now, Shakespeare, this is the Freudian reading of Hamlet. Shakespeare's doing something similar, although it's splitting the father into three. I mean, we don't know whether Hamlet's father was a good man. We don't know whether he was a good king. This is just Hamlet idealises his father after his father's death. People can sometimes do this. And if it's done as in extreme fashion of Hamlet's, you can suspect this is to do with guilt. This is to do with some unresolved aspect of the person who's idealising the father or idealising the mother. Can work with mothers too.
Didn't Shakespeare's father die the year he wrote Hamlet?
I thought it was his son.
His son, who was named Hamlet. Is that... you might be right. You might be right. Yeah, something like that. There's certainly personal, there are biographical elements going on here. Are there any questions about that? So he's arguing that Hamlet can't kill Claudius because he's paralysed. He's psychologically paralysed because of guilt. Guilt feelings about identification with Claudius and over his incestuous attachment to his mother. And the fact that he comes to mind such lurid sexual imagery about his mother sleeping with... What he really can't stand is the thought of his mother sleeping with Claudius, 30-year-old Hamlet, which really supports the Freudian reading. That, Hamlet's deepest fantasy is his own sexual relations with his mother. And he got used to the fact that his father was, sleeping with his mother. But now his uncle comes along and is sleeping with his mother, and it just drives him crazy, the thought.
But there is also the very real element that she remarried so quickly after the death of his father.
And it's his uncle.
And
it's his uncle, so it's incestuous.
yes, there is
But
that true. It would have been less surprising in those times because you need continuity of monarchy.
Yeah.
She's the queen, so there would have been. It's much less surprising than to us. Although Hamlet doesn't like the fact it's only 1 month.
I think it's more related to his betrayal. He feels betrayed
Yeah,
by
I'm
his
betrayed.
mother.
I'm betrayed by my
How
mother.
dare you marry someone else?
Yeah, rather than just keep relations with me now that my father's gone. Yeah, exactly.
Claudius was his father's brother. Is that
Yes,
right?
yes.
And that's taboo in...
No.
It was at the time because the Bible's against it.
There's sort of a combination of it's like Bible elements, but also of, is it Seneca, the Roman poet?
Yeah, the Roman
Who
poet
was
Seneca. There's
about
no problem.
revenge and so on. So there was
Revenge going on. There's no problem with marrying his father's brother. There's no biological. There's no incestuous.
Yeah, but it's in the Bible, and they would have known at the time it's very against it, that you're not meant to.
I think that's under Catholicism, isn't it? Also?
Yeah, well, it says in the Bible, so...
But it was
There
something...
are elements in the Gospels along those lines, but there are counter elements too.
Well, but it says distinctly that you're not meant to marry your brother's widow.
It would come up in the
Yeah.
play if that was a
Yeah.
huge issue.
But it would have been in the context of the knowledge of...
This play is so wordy, it tells us everything, what was going through people's minds, especially Hamlet's mind. That's not the problem. The Bible, and Hamlet's not very religious. Where's God? Where's Christ? Hamlet's not a sort of devout, practicing Christian
But there's
at all.
still elements of it when he's worried that he doesn't want to kill Claudius when he's praying because Claudius will go to heaven.
But maybe that's just another one of his rationalisations. That it's just finding another excuse why I don't do it in the chapel. It's another procrastination, rather than he actually fears that.
Still, it should be considered.
So that Hamlet respects men who act on their passions and act on their wills because he can't. Does that mean that he also has a form of respect for Claudius because he acted on his passion and
Maybe.
what he wanted to do?
Maybe, yes. Yes, there could be hidden respect for Claudius. And the ghost, actually, your assumption in the play is that Claudius has killed his brother in order to get the throne for power reasons, whereas the ghost says it was for lust. So in other words, he did it because it was attraction to Gertrude, not his principal motive is sexual, not overpower.
Which for Hamlet would be even worse because of his attraction
Yes,
to his mother.
exactly, yeah. And which would be Hamlet's, if we're going through Hamlet's psychology, his psychology is all about that. Yes.
Had he felt that it was for power, would he still have felt as strongly towards killing him?
Well, if the Freudian reading is correct and persuasive, no. No, this is all about family drama, Hamlet's relationship to mother and father.
I was just going to add, with Freud, is there any relation to the 3 stages, the oral, the
Not really, no.
Not even
No,
with the
not
knife,
really, no.
stabbing or anything?
No.
No.
No, you wouldn't go into that.
Okay.
The play's wordy enough.
All right, what do you think? Is this off with the fairies or plausible?
It has elements, as you can see by the descriptions, like the end of descriptions that Hamlet goes into when he speaks of the sexual interactions with the mother and the uncle. But also, if it's his inability to act, I'm sure there are other reasons as well. You can't just say that, yes, Freud was right, and this is this.
Why
because-
can't it? When you need to find the other reasons.
Yeah.
No, I agree. I mean, I think that the Freudian account can be an account, but not necessarily. Like, we can explain
The only
everything.
account.
Yeah, like the reason for delaying in the chapel could be not necessarily because he himself is religious, but because Claudius is. In the same way that Ethan shot the eyes out of the Indian, you know, I don't want to kill him now because as he's dying, he'll feel peace because he's just prey. You know, and then other hesitations, what were other reasons I can't remember, but there were others. He needed to know for sure.
Well, after the play, when the play finishes,
yeah,
Claudius
exactly.
rushes off.
There can be other reasons, I think. It doesn't have to be, but...
Of course, there can be. Motivation can be multiple. Have multiple motives. Just starting with the Freudian.
It can be a facet of depression too, that inability to take action and to be bogged down with your thoughts.
Well, the Freudian argument would be Hamlet's depressed, paralysed, depressed because of the inhibition over father-mother. So he's explaining, Freud is explaining the depression rather than using depression to explain something else.
I think it's a combination of all the different factors.
Is it clear, that argument? Fairly clear? It's written at length by one of Freud's followers, Ernest Jones. We've got to follow it up. In a book called Hamlet, and it was in the library. And there are other key works of Shakespeare where the Oedipal explanation doesn't work particularly, like King Lear doesn't work particularly well. I'm certainly not trying to convert you to Freudian explanations for everything. But it's certainly got a lot of potency in relation to this play.
Before Freud, what was the main argument?
Before Freud, well, the writing on Hamlet up to about 1770, it takes Hamlet as a sort of hero, uncomplicated hero. It's with the Romantic movement that people start to write about the melancholy, overthoughtful, moody Hamlet. The sort of Hamlet that we know comes into the writing from about 1770 onwards. Look, this endless. I mean, some are silly, like that. He's got a conscience about murder, which is going to stand up. There are moral. We'll come to this. Maybe come to this a bit later. Other readings of Hamlet's paralysis. We can talk about Hamlet's paralysis or his inability to act. I mean, generally they take the line that he thinks too much. He's too... And he is, in one of the appeals of the play, he is a sort of modern hero. You know, he's intelligent, he's insightful, he's sensitive, he's courageous, he fears nobody. In fact, even the king fears him. 30-year-old, he's very eligible, he's a prince, plenty of money, good background, he's well educated, he's been to German university, Wittenberg, travelled. He's a sort of type of modern hero, modern intellectual hero. Reflects a lot, very articulate, extremely articulate.
Claudius says that he's very popular, which is...
And he's very popular amongst the people. Yep. One reason that Claudius doesn't want to kill him. Yeah. The other reason being his mother's attachment to him. Yeah, so Hamlet's popular. But he's not just a sort of lonely melancholic. When that maybe that suggests that the earlier Hamlet was less depressed. The Freudian reading would suggest this Oedipal complex that he has means that he would have had this problem before the actual death of his father, Hamlet.
So how does Ophelia fit into that complex?
All right, how does Ophelia? Let's switch to Ophelia. How old's Ophelia? You know? She's young, 15, naive, green, innocent, teenager, carefully watched by family, especially father, not uncommon in the times, worried about her losing her virtue.
Is that what they're worried about when they warn her off him, or is it because he's not evil?
Well, it's probably that she's not quite high enough in birth for Hamlet to really want to marry her, but he's worried, the father's worried about her losing her virginity, and Hamlet just exploiting her. Yeah, and the father's rational worries given the situation, caring for a daughter. Why does Hamlet turn on? He becomes very nasty to Ophelia, doesn't he?
But then it's all part of his pretend madness, isn't it?
Oh, he's pretty vicious to Ophelia. You look at the end of the To Be or Not to Be speech, he says, "Get thee to a nunnery." Have you picked up what that's actually saying? Nunnery's Elizabethan slang for a brothel. He's basically calling her a whore. You know, this is a sort of, naive, green 15-year-old who's been in love with Hamlet, and her boyfriend's suddenly calling her a whore, and she paints her face, she lies, she sort of savage attack on Ophelia. Why does he do it? Careful reading of the text. Why does he do it?
Is it related because he's against all women? He thinks that they're inconstant because of his mother remarrying so quickly?
It's partly it. Women are deceitful. Like my mother, is the person in the world I'm closest to, has just done this completely inexplicable thing, married this lousy character, my uncle. So, how can you trust women?
And he probably felt betrayed too because of the whole Oedipus thing. Like, how could his mother, they've got this close relationship. Like, ideally, he's like, in the Oedipus thing, it's sort of, when his father died, she should have been happy to just be with, or, not to remarry and just have a relationship with her son. Maybe.
That's perhaps there too. But concretely, it's worth reading carefully. They meet after the To Be or Not to Be speech. Ophelia turns up. He is quite attentive to her at the start. Nymph in thy orisons, prayers, be all my sins remembered. The fair Ophelia, he calls them. And then he becomes distracted. And then very soon he's expressing hostility. And then before long he asks her, "Are you honest?" This is to Ophelia. What's going on there? Are you honest?
Perhaps he's seeing through her as well that she's been manipulated to be there by Polonius and Claudius.
Suspects that, he sort of picks up, this is his intuition. Ophelia is part of the fact that Claudius and her father are eavesdropping behind the curtain at this point.
And she's withdrawn as well because Polonius has told her to back away, so she's sort of withdrawn from Hamlet and wants to give back the letters that he's given her and everything. So
that wouldn't worry. I mean, that would be just normal backwards and forwards. And, if he's really interested in her, I don't think that should inhibit him. But yes, the big charge is, are you honest? And then a bit further on, line about 130, where's your father? And she replies, at home, my lord, which is a lie. So the father's behind the curtain listening in. This is the painted. This is women paint their faces. There's one face, paint on another face. Deception. And Hamlet sort of picked this up. But he's really savage, this poor 15-year-old girl. If thou dost marry, I'll give thee this plague for thy dowry. Be thou as chaste as ice, as pure as snow, thou shalt not escape calumny. Get thee to a nunnery, get thee to a brothel. Go, farewell. Or if you will marry, marry a fool, for wise men know well enough what monsters you make of them. To a nunnery go, and quickly too, farewell. I mean, Hamlet's really in a rage. It's again sexual imagery. The betrayal, Ophelia's betrayal, translates in his mind into chastity, frigidity, nunnery, the play on nunnery, brothel. Now this would be deeply shocking to Ophelia. It's one of the reasons she goes mad. Now she's in a difficult position, isn't she? I mean, she's close to her father. Her father's a father. He's basically giving her advice. Tell him, beware, Hamlet's just after your virtue. He won't marry you. father said, we're going to the king, and the father are behind the curtain. Basically, she obeys her father, close to her father. And it's out of those circumstances that she ends up lying to Hamlet. Is there any other betrayal of Hamlet?
Well, I was just going to say, it's like he's asking her to think for herself and ask questions of truth in herself, not unknown.
Well, he's certainly asking her to be honest to him. But, you know, she's in a very, very difficult position. Hamlet justified in calling her a whore in these circumstances?
I understand why he's angry. I mean,
I don't understand why he's angry, but you know, he's 30, she's 15. Assume she's 15.
but back then, does that matter? I mean, isn't that a normal age for young girls to be
Yeah,
going
but
after?
it's, I mean, he's travelled, he's a man of the world, he's been to university, you know, he understands. Whereas she's had a very closeted background. Other betrayals of Hamlet by Ophelia? I mean, betrayal is very much on Hamlet's mind, obviously, right, linked to the mother.
Well, yeah, she tells her dad that he's crazy.
And she also shows letters,
Yeah.
Hamlet's letters to her father, which again, sort of understandable, but why does she go mad? No reason to find an external thing like this madness in the family. We've got no evidence for that.
Well, it's all probably a bit too much that her father gets killed and then Hamlet is exiled and her brother's off overseas.
Yep.
And she's the only one left in the country. It's just too much.
Yeah.
I think Shakespeare was misogynistic and had no real concept of strong women. I find it, no, seriously, I find it a little bit unbelievable that Ophelia just goes mad like that.
Well, she has been kind of left by herself, and with her, not only is her father dead, but her boyfriend killed her father, and now he's in exile, and she's got no one left.
But to actually go insane, like, that's a pretty strong
Well, look,
reaction.
what about the circumstances? Her boyfriend kills her father. Where does he kill the father?
In like his mother's chambers.
Yeah, and he does it by the father's behind the curtain, and who's Ophelia's act in being complicit in the father being behind the curtain in the first scene, overhearing Hamlet. It's almost as if the same scene is repeated, but this time Hamlet kills her father. So she has this shame. Just some seats down the way.
So you reckon the insanity was, I guess, an idea of guilt? That if originally she had not allowed her father to go behind the curtain, he wouldn't have done it a second time.
Well, Hamlet's reacted to that by calling her a whore. Again, a lot of shame associations with Ophelia. Blush of modesty, blush, shame blushes runs the head. And someone sort of innocent and naive teenage girl, understandable. So she'd be deep, and this is Hamlet basically makes sexual jokes in public in the theatre scene, makes jokes about country matters in front of everyone else. It'd be deeply embarrassing to Ophelia. It's basically called her a whore, and a liar, and a cheat. And then her father ends up being killed by Hamlet in exactly the situation that she's been complicit in father over listening into Hamlet on the first occasion. So in her own mind, almost got the association with that she's somehow complicit in the death of her father at Hamlet's hands. And this is something we'll come back into in later sessions, but Ophelia, in her own mind, has broken a major law, thou shalt not betray trust. A major moral law, thou shalt not betray trust, which she's awoken to by Hamlet. Hamlet's assault, you are a whore, you're a prostitute, lock yourself up in a nunnery.
Is that what he really wants to say to his mother? Maybe?
Well, he sort of almost goes as far as actually saying it to his mother. Yeah, the two are certainly doubling up. His mother, of course, can take it. She's 50-year-old plus woman. Yes.
Did Ophelia actually sleep with Hamlet?
Well, you would assume not. So the two men she loves, one's calling her a whore and the other's dead, her father. And somehow it's somehow her breaking the thou shalt not betray trust moral law that's at the core of this. And all the shame of the prostitute, whore attacks.
Yeah, they were publicly announced, those sort of, you were a whore almost, were almost publicly announced to the people that even if she didn't have her father or her boyfriend, she could be with, like, in its social context. Well, that's all removed because of Hamlet's actions or actions
Maybe.
with. So
Probably
she
more
really
immediate response. Hamlet she loves, who's basically telling her she's a whore. And the father is always warning her that Hamlet's after her virtue, wants to sleep with her. And this, in the context of the story, this is what drives them mad. I mean, it's very carefully worked through. Are you honest? Painted face. The shame. She goes mad out of shame. Shame, in some ways, you could call the sacred or the holy emotion. When you're ashamed, you lower your head as if you're being judged from above. Go read it in the neck, read it in the nape of the neck. It's like she's almost like she's betrayed higher law. A strong case of shame, powerful case of shame, which Ophelia is.
And she would be feeling that because in her eyes, not being as high as her status not being as high as Hamlet's. She, the noble family does carry some, I suppose, judgment power.
Yeah, and she presumably she loves Hamlet. She admires him, and he's very eloquent. Yeah. No, I mean, if you put yourself in her shoes, given who she is, I don't think it's so difficult to understand. The first words of her first mad song.
It's all about love stories.
How should I be your true love know? It's just questioning love. She doesn't know. She's sort of thrown off about how can you, when love at the moment the most important thing for her. How can you know who loves or what? Her mind is overturned by what's happened, and then she drowns herself. I mean, Hamlet's surely, partly, very significantly responsible for it. I mean, his attack on her is right over the top. Yes? Other interpretations of Hamlet's paralysis, the Hamlet problem. There's a possible moral reading that Hamlet's sense of order in the world and of meaning has been really compromised by his mother's behaviour. And she's the person he was closest to. And she's done this utterly unimaginable thing.
Is he afraid of what will happen after the finality of death?
Is
he afraid of something that will come after that? A consequence that maybe he's not sure of after he...
like his own death.
Yeah.
Well, he says in the to be or not to be speech, doesn't he? It's only fear of what comes after that stops us killing ourselves. So there's some of that.
But is there some sort of spiritual thing there he has? You know?
Have you got evidence from the text?
Well, no, I'm asking.
Hamlet's religious or spiritual beliefs or attachments? I mean, it's an interesting question, important question. What are they? Or just not clear?
Yeah, when he refers to death, he only refers to it as the unknown, really. He doesn't really talk about the heavens, or only in a metaphorical sense, or hell. He doesn't seem to care which one he goes to.
Yeah, he doesn't, it's not on his mind, there's this horrible hell with fire and death for eternity and the devil, is it? And Hamlet's someone, if that was at all in his mind, we'd hear about it.
With Yorick's skull, he talks about just simply getting eaten by worms and becoming dust.
Death
So I
is
don't
death
think-
and just eaten by worms. Yeah. Exactly. I mean, that in Act 5, that powerful speech to Yorick's skull in the graveyard is that death is just death, rot and stink. That's the main Hamlet, isn't it? With no strong religious belief at all. He's not obviously Christian. Does God appear in the text at all? Is there any God in the play Hamlet?
Apart from the reference to heaven, which we're having to assume God, but that's how I think.
Yeah, in passing.
Yeah. Well, we didn't kill him in the church, but that's.
And that may be just an excuse. Another excuse is not to kill Claudius.
Well, he believes in it, so he could be right. He's not like, he didn't specifically say because I believe it. And he's like, nah, I'm not going to do it now because of this reason that I just account with just then.
Isn't the dad, or the ghost, I should say, purgatory?
The ghosts put him in purgatory, yeah. The spirit of his father's still in purgatory. Yeah, that's certainly there. The ghost in the play, which it's possible to read it as a Hamlet fantasy, but then why are other people seeing the ghost?
Maybe that's part of his fantasy also.
Well, it's too concrete, that.
And after his death, Horatio says, now I'll tell you the story. He couldn't continue to imagine Horatio telling the story of the ghost after it's been dead.
Yeah.
It's definitely a ghost.
It's definitely a ghost. But Hamlet, it doesn't send Hamlet into great fantasies about the next life or God or Jesus the Saviour or anything like that. And actually when he talks about conscience in the to be or not to be speech, it's not conscience in relation to God, it's just my conscience. It's a very humanist, sort of non-religious concept of conscience.
So there's certain religious elements, but they're probably more just those parts that would have been everyday sort of generally accepted at that time. But yeah, he's not overly religious himself.
And Shakespeare's plays are not particularly Christian in general, in particular in this one. But it's one reason the plays continued into the modern world quite happily. You don't have to discount strong Christian views, or practicing Christian views in reading Hamlet. So the ghost is the ghost. With going back to the Freudian reading, there's an element of that before I come back to the moral reading I wanted to go into. The Freudian reading stresses that the inhibition in relationship to Claudius is just as strong as the incest in relation to his mother. But I wonder whether that's plausible, whether the mother isn't the stronger motivation. I mean, when Hamlet hears from the father's ghost about what's happened, and certainly Hamlet's father wants revenge, i.e. kill Claudius, the focus of that speech is on Claudius's evil, not on mother's bad behaviour. You remember Hamlet's first response to that speech? It should be about Claudius, but it's not. It's "O most pernicious woman." This is 105. In Hamlet's mind, in response to hearing that his uncles killed his father poisoned through the ear, instead of "O villain, villain," smiling down the villain, which is his second response, you'd imagine that to be first. Claudius is a villain, I've got to take revenge. That's the weather. His first reaction is "O most pernicious woman." So in other words, it's his mother who is predominant in his mind. Which suggests that the attachment to the mother, the incestuous attachment to the mother. In most human societies, there's an incest taboo, as Freud calls it, and in most human societies, the strongest incest taboo is over mother-son incest. It's part of this Freudian reading about the Oedipal complex, that this is a major problem, and most societies put a very, very heavy taboo on sexual relations between mothers and sons for that reason. Incest taboo. And you might even feed that into Hamlet's paralysis, in that he just doesn't care enough about his uncle. He's preoccupied with his relation with his mother, and he can't, in a way, he just can't be bothered killing his uncle. He's not my real problem. My real problem is my mother.
Is the mother complicit in the murder?
No, there's no suggestion of that, no. No, and in Hamlet's mind, she's not either. It's that she's married a month later. Well, she's married at all, the fact it's only a month. Yeah, no. But it's possible the mother, we assume the mother preferred Hamlet's father and not Claudius. It's possible the other way around. I mean, Claudius is a pretty competent king. He's a much better king than Hamlet's father. That's possible.
I read it a little bit differently personally. Like, the way it seemed to be represented, I guess, the way I seem to have read it is the king and the spirit, I guess, represented like the Denmark or the wealth, I guess, being poisoned, in a sense that the original rule, how everything was, you didn't know it was almost good or bad or anything, but when Claudius came in, the fact that there was ghosts apparent, and that's like, it's not a thing before, but it's only a thing after, almost represents that Claudius is like evil. That's how I sort of read it.
Mm-hmm.
Because this, if you want to bring into the supernatural, the ghosts are now part of that they weren't before, but they are after. Kind of is what I was looking at in a sense.
Well, Hamlet certainly regards it as evil, and the people, Hamlet's popular with the people, so maybe they're not too happy about the change too. So that's all possible also. And I saw a production of Hamlet, the Bell Shakespeare Company, about 15 years ago in Melbourne, and actually in that production made Claudius quite attractive. Gertrude was attracted to Claudius, and it was plausible. You can play Claudius different ways. I mean, it's a bit beside the point in relationship to the central Hamlet issue.
And perhaps in earlier readings, the mother would have had something to do with the murder, because then it would have been plausible for Hamlet to just be this hero that avenges his father's death, because this couple here, intended all along to be together.
Except that's not in the text. There's no suggestion in the text of the mother being. No, that's... You've really got to add that. All right, so back to the moral reading. The Hamlet's sort of flattened morally in terms of Hamlet's sense of the world and of order and of how the world operates. He's just flattened by his mother's behaviour. The person he's closest to, most admires, most loves, has done something completely incomprehensible, marrying Claudius, marrying an evil man. And at that point, it's a sort of existential crisis for Hamlet. His sense of order and meaning is shattered. Now that's got nothing to do with the Freudian reading in those terms. It can quite happily sit with the Freudian reading, but it's got absolutely nothing to do with the Freudian reading.
Does he say something too somewhere about the father's ghost when it appears as it also being a sign of order being...
Out of joint.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, there's Denmark, things are out of...
Yeah.
I think something's rotten in the state of Denmark, things are out of joint. Yeah, there is repeated references of that sort, yes. And it's my job to set it right, and for some reason I can't do it. I've been called to set order right, to restore order. That's what Ethan does in the Searchers. Hamlet's an anti-Ethan. They're exact opposites almost. Ethan restores order, Hamlet compounds the disorder. Hamlet's dithering means the stage ends up littered with corpses.
So I think the way that Shakespeare tells the story is the audience is meant to see it as incestuous as well and think this isn't right.
Mm-hmm.
So while it's disorder, but he's returning the state of Denmark to an orderly moral condition. And at the end, the Fortinbras is coming onto the scene, seeming to restore order in the way that Shakespeare presents as the morally acceptable way that the state should be.
So it's been necessary for all the principal characters to die, and then an outsider comes in, becomes king, and then everything's all right.
Yep.
Well, it's a possible reading. A sort of sensible, simple man ends up as king of Denmark, and history then goes on.
Very interested in the dynamic in the relationship of Horatio and Hamlet, because if we are to dismiss the ghost as being a reality, for example, like we were saying initially in class, what would psychologically be wrong with him if it wasn't supernatural? Then what would then the dynamic of Horatio and him be? Because there is an element of he just puts his trust in him.
In Horatio. Yes.
And he trusts pretty much no one else but Horatio.
Yes.
So I was really interested in that.
Well, Horatio is his friend, isn't it? We have an image of friendship as a it's fairly important. Although there's not much space given to the friendship. It's quite an unusual positive in this play, that Hamlet's respect for Horatio, based on the fact that Horatio is
courageous,
sensible, and balanced. He's not a man of a bit like the Greek ideal last week of balance.
Because it could have been Horatio, by him being the sensible person, he can see as an outsider that the king has been murdered. And if Hamlet is depressed and manic almost, and Horatio tells him his thoughts, this ghost could just be a fabrication of Hamlet's mind, given that that's what Horatio told him, and because he trusts Horatio so.
Except the ghost doesn't speak to Horatio. He only speaks to Hamlet.
Exactly. Could it not just be a fabrication because of what Horatio told him? We are assuming...
I think the problem with that is the picture we get of Horatio is of a very sensible, down-to-earth, balanced character whose judgment of things is always right and who's loyal to Hamlet.
And it could be in the loyalty that becomes apparent. Like loyalty to Hamlet. So if Hamlet has said this has happened, then okay, whether it happened or not, the loyalty becomes paramount rather than the
What's the problem with the ghost, by the way, apart from, some of you might not believe in ghosts? I mean, what the ghost says, everything else in the play supports as being true. What's the problem with the ghost?
It's too easy.
It's a device in the story. The ghost gets Hamlet to swear. What does he get him to swear to?
And he will kill Claudius.
Does he, literally, what's the... He says, remember me. Jera, remember me, the ghost. And we don't know how Hamlet could possibly not remember the ghost. I have sworn to remember, Father, and I guess that means what he said. There's an oath. We talked a lot about oaths 2 weeks ago in the searches. Hamlet makes an oath to his father's ghost to remember him and, by implication, take revenge. We've had so we've got a second, a sort of moral, existential reading of Hamlet's paralysis. The world's lost sense or meaning for him, so he just can't be bothered. He's depressed for another reason than the Freudian reason. He just can't be bothered doing what he should do. Can't be bothered becoming king. Everything's lost its meaning because of his mother's behaviour. A number of you brought up the thinking theme, that Hamlet thinks too much. I mean, it's often said that intellectuals or poets or writers think too much and can't act. Sort of the Alexander the Great's, Julius Caesar's men of action, although actually in both those cases they did write. But actually, the sort of pure man of action doesn't fit some of Hamlet's ideal men of action figures. About this thinking. Hamlet himself, at the end of the to be or not to be speech, famous lines, conscience doth make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sickly o'er with the pale cast of thought. The conscience has made me a coward. But conscience, what does that mean with Hamlet? It's not conscience in the sense of thou shalt not kill.
He says, the undiscovered country from its born no travel returns, puzzles the world and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others we know not of. It's like you said before, he's putting on suicide.
So his conscience is, I'm just, I'd really like to kill myself, but it's only fear of what happens after death that stops me. So conscience is consciousness of, how miserable I think everything is.
He's basically saying better the devil you know.
Which is a miserable life rather than death, in the to be or not to be speech.
My footnote here, where it says, when he says, thus conscience does make cowards of us all, the footnoted meaning for conscience is self-consciousness or introspection. So yeah, introspection
rather than
makes...
moral bad conscience.
Yeah, so introspection or overthinking makes cowards of us because we get so bogged down in the thinking that we can't take action.
And it reminds me of the thing we did last week about how being a good person is being true to yourself and what makes you sleep at night. So there is an element of that there.
Well, Socrates would say, what would Socrates say about Hamlet? That Hamlet should,
just kill him.
The right thing is to do to kill Claudius and kill him, but Hamlet can't do it. And Hamlet thinks that's the right thing for Hamlet to do. So Hamlet's a counterexample of Socrates. Socrates assumes if you know what you should do, then there's no reason you don't act on it. Hamlet knows what he should do, but he can't act. This is a modern situation, although it's 400 years old. modern counselling psychotherapy is full of Hamlets, this eloquent Hamlets. People who know their condition. This is why I'm choosing this. I keep choosing the same sort of relationship again and again and again. I'm always miserable. It's always the same sort of people. I can't stop myself. You're conscious of the problem, but you can't do anything about it. And that's the Hamlet. With the will, the will's the problem, not the consciousness. The will. Now Hamlet's set, Shakespeare's one of the great humanists. It's set in the Renaissance, it's set in the humanist period, which has governed so much of our thinking ever since. One of the central humanist beliefs is in free will, that we are free to do whatever we want. And that makes us human. That gives dignity to us being human individuals, free will. Reason and free will. Hamlet's very rational, he has a reason. But he doesn't do what he thinks and what most of the people in the play think he should do, kill Claudius. It's almost like if we ask the freedom question, you think you're free to do lots of things in your lives. The only thing Hamlet's free to do is free not to do what he should do. Very strange. Free not to follow Socrates. Although he doesn't want even to do it. He wants to kill Claudius, but he just can't do it. Especially modern problem. There's some sort of inhibition, paralysis, guilt, stopping you doing what you want to do. I mean, care of Freud and others, we've got probably more powerful tools for analysing this than just saying I'm too self-conscious. You know, the modern feeling, if only I could do, and then you end up blaming, I haven't got time, I'm too busy, but if you're honest, that's not true. There's always time if you really want to do something. If the will's there, there's always time, there's always opportunity.
This is fear, isn't it?
Fun? Fear.
It's based on fear.
What's Hamlet's fear? This is our test case today. What's his fear if he's afraid? Is he paralysed by fear? It's not fear of hell.
No, it's not that.
Fear of what?
It's not I don't know.
To do the wrong thing.
He doesn't. But what's the wrong thing? He doesn't fear breaking thou shalt not kill. That would be the normal thing.
He does have a sense of justice, though.
Yeah, to act justice.
He does have a sense of justice. Because he keeps telling everyone else they're lying and he's on and on about truths. And
my sense of justice is I have to avenge my father's murder by killing Claudius. That's his sense of justice.
But he's got this impossibility, or his own sense of impossibility of certainty, which stops him from acting until he is 100% certain. And then after that, it's beginning to get the motivation. So I think it was up to about the third.
When was he certain?
The play.
Play, and that's very early on.
Yeah, but then he
doesn't
gets
have
exiled almost immediately.
But he's got plenty of time. They're all wandering around the court. It's a very small palace. Plenty of opportunity to kill Claudius. He kills Rosencrantz and Guildenstern instead, and then kills Polonius instead.
Then is it the fear of being persecuted?
No, the people love him. People would be happy.
Is it fear of being king, becoming king?
He doesn't talk about that. I think if his fear is I'm not up to being king, I'm going to be a bad king, I'm going to be a weak king, I don't want to be king, we would have heard that sort of speech from Hamlet.
Maybe it relates to killing himself. He sees so much of himself in his uncle, and it's like he's talking about that fear of the unknown, killing himself. He doesn't want to do that. Maybe it's the same
You're
thing.
back to Freudian rating of I am Claudius.
I still think a lot of his inaction comes back to the depression.
Yeah, but what causes the depression? And so we've got a very acute, that's why Freud chooses Hamlet and Oedipus. We've got an analysis of the source of depression.
But depression doesn't have to have a necessary. I mean, it's been triggered by the death of his father and the remarriage of his mother. But depression can also be a physiological chemical imbalance in the brain.
Okay.
So is it just that he's triggered by these events, but one of the symptoms of depression can be a lack of ability to take action?
I
Possibly. I mean, it makes the play rather uninteresting. He's biologically, genetically determined depressive. The play provides lots and lots of evidence for psychological readings and moral readings. It's a very, very detailed play, so it's a bit of a cop-out to go down that path.
He's lost purpose. He's lost purpose. He doesn't have.
He's lost purpose, but why has he lost purpose? That's the question.
Because he's lost any kind of will to
Why is
act
it
in
dead?
any way, whether it
He
be
has.
killing. And I think it's from that loss of will. But what's created that loss of will?
Yeah,
That
that's
I
the
think.
question. Yes. What's caused the lack of will? I mean, he does act on impulse, doesn't he? He stabs Polonius. He can act. He's quite happy to rifle the letter and change it so Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are killed. He's not completely without his capacity for action. He puts a mirror up in front of his mother. He confronts his mother.
Perhaps because he stopped trusting, I suppose, his instincts and over-rationalising by his overthinking and his over-rationalising and his heavy dependence on what his mind tells him.
Mm-hmm.
That's perhaps why he's lost will, because it doesn't come from the conscience and the rationalising. That will and action perhaps comes from somewhere else.
So if he's in a normal situation of reflection, he can't act, but if his events take over and he's precipitated in this, he's talking to his mother, he hears rustling behind the curtain, that then on impulse he stabs the curtain. When he gets involved in all the fighting at the end, he can act quite happily in that situation. But it needs to be, I mean, we all would all understand this situation, that the sort of the heat of the moment or impulse takes over, and at that point he can move, he can act.
Does he really think it's Claudius behind the curtain when he stabs?
He doesn't know. He thinks
What, would you just stab someone because they're hiding? Like, I don't understand that act. Like, ooh, there's someone here, stab.
He is erratic. Is he partly mad? I mean, one of the questions in the play is Hamlet partly mad, or is it just staged? I'm mad north by northwest.
He's obsessive.
In what sense?
That he's completely focused on it.
He's preoccupied by what's happened. But it's sort of, I think obsessive is probably the wrong word, because it's understandable he's preoccupied by what's happened.
I think in small part he might be just a little bit of sociopath in just how he's behaving.
Yep.
He doesn't seem to really feel anything in his interactions with people.
Well, you could certainly say that in relation to Ophelia. His mockings of Polonius.
It seems like he's so caught up in what's happened, what's going on, and the nature of how it's come to his attention that he's crazed by it, and still trying to keep concealed his real motives and what he wants to do to the king. He's playing into the craziness when they're trying to investigate his behaviour. But I feel like talking about strategies in the writing of the play, I think that Horatio, as the very level-headed, logical, fair-minded character, is there to interact with Hamlet throughout the play to remind us that in fact he is well within his capacities, and everything else is just part of this process to get to killing Claudius. If that makes sense.
Except his reflections on himself is that this is not a carefully developed plan which I'm going through and it's all going to reach point X. His reflections on himself is, why can't I do it? Why haven't I got the passion? Why can't I do it?
But he's not
like
crazy,
actors?
Pardon? He's not crazy though, I don't think.
No, and the fact that he says that I'm acting in a slightly crazy manner just to throw people off the scent, and then the king realises in fact he's not crazy, and he needs to take him very seriously as an enemy. So he's thinking, back to the thinking things, he thinks too much. Is that, in Socrates last week saying the best thing in life is to think on the right course of behaviour than to act. Hamlet is more like he's thinking as an excuse, or a rationalisation. He's paralysed, therefore, out of frustration with himself, he thinks. It's rationalised use, Freudian use of the word rationalisation. I can't do the one thing I really think I should do, and then out of frustration I talk, and I'll think. And I'll find all sorts of excuses why I can't do what I should do. I mean, we live in a world where, everyone does this a lot of the time. Tries to find excuses why I haven't done what I think I probably should have done.
It sounded before when you mentioned passion again that it really did seem to link with my passion's already taken up. And you can interpret it in different ways, whether you interpret it as thinking, I'm busy thinking about what's going on with my mother, or I'm busy feeling what is going on with my mother. He really is caught up there. And I guess another word that comes to mind with all the sexual themes is impotence. He's impotent to act. What will happen in the end? He ends up with his mum. That doesn't quite sound like what it should.
Not a practical solution. It's a metaphor. Well, you all know situations or people who suddenly come and go, you have a high-charged 20-minute monologue on what's just happened. Often it's a way of letting off steam, talking, reflecting. And it's actually got nothing to do with Socrates' stuff about talking in order to do the right thing. It's more in reaction to something that's made you very uncomfortable, whether someone else's behaviour or your own. Rationalising. Trying to find excusing reasons.
Procrastination.
Caught up in procrastination maybe, or displacement away from what would be the right way to handle this. Not balanced. Freud says that the reason that we've been so interested in Hamlet is that Hamlet's everybody. That in everybody's life there is this unconscious, deeply troubled unconscious relationship to both of your parents, or the key male and female figures in your early life. They don't actually have to be your biological parents, but it's usually biological parents. And Hamlet, like the play Oedipus, works out consciously all these very, very traumatic, guilt-ridden secrets about fantasy, wish, even sort of, murder, violent fantasies, killing fathers, killing mothers, daughters killing mothers, sons killing fathers. This story happens to be some mother. And the reason, that's the Freudian argument, the reason for this great popularity is Hamlet does in public or in consciousness addresses the key psychological problem for all human individuals. That's the reason it continues to be so sort of pertinent. But there are other themes too, like this one. You can link it to the Freudian or you can keep it separate. The sort of whole business about trying to find justifying reasons. Uneasiness about what should I do, what shouldn't I do, the Socrates question. I fear that I haven't done the right thing, I fear I haven't chosen the right path, I fear I'm not in a relationship with the right person. And then the whole trying to find reasons, thinking, or explanations or theories. Now Hamlet is the great example of someone who does that, rationalises. But is his thinking doing much good? Is it helpful? Does it make him happier? Does it make him saner? No. Does it make him more admirable?
More trouble.
More trouble? It certainly makes him more trouble.
It adds components to his problem. Because the more he thinks, the more components, the more variables he comes up with.
Yeah, it compounds his problems. And if you take the Searcher's standpoint from 2 weeks ago and you stand back, I mean, if Hamlet had done what he should do, killed Claudius, then order would have been restored in Denmark, Hamlet would be king, almost everyone would still be alive, And his own inability to act means that virtually everyone gets killed. So the moral consequences, just from Socrates' standpoint, the moral consequences of Hamlet's paralysis are terrible. His cowardliness, his dithering, whatever he calls himself a whore too, doesn't he? He associates himself with prostitution. What's going on there? Any idea? It's probably to do with no honourable purpose. I've got no driving, honourable purpose to do what I should do. I'm outside morality.
You think too, like he sees his mother as being inconstant for having remarried so quickly. Does he perhaps see himself as being inconstant because he can't get the gumption to actually kill Claudius?
Yeah. I think that's part of it too, yes, you're right, that association. We've also got the subplot all the time of Laertes. Laertes got problems with his father, Polonius. Polonius' father doesn't trust son. It's a recurring theme in this play. But Laertes is a man of action. When his father gets killed, he comes home, nothing's going to stop him taking revenge, killing Hamlet. He'll kill Hamlet in the chapel. All sorts of suggestions of Laertes is what Hamlet would like to be. Not much conscience, but he's just going to do what needs doing, kill Hamlet to avenge his father's death. So we've got all the time this parallel story to Hamlet. It does reinforce the first part of the Freudian reading that the story is partly preoccupied by fathers and sons, problems and relations between fathers and sons. Polonius sends a spy out to spy on his son.
There's a lot of spying right throughout the whole play. Everyone's spying on everyone. Sort of,
Mistrust
and deceit and deception.
Yeah, probably in Shakespeare's work, the greatest sin or crime is betraying trust. Hamlet feels his mother's betrayed his trust, and Ophelia's betrayed his trust. Thou shalt not betray trust is a very important moral law for Shakespeare. Do you like Hamlet himself? Attractive? Likeable? Admirable?
I identified with him when I was a teenager. I remember studying this in high school and really identified, but I think it was that whole melancholic theme when I was a teenager. I was melancholic and everything, but now not maybe quite so much. Get a bit impatient with him and stuff. For God's sake, just do something.
Anyone else?
I like his sense of intelligence.
Yeah. His intelligence is attractive, isn't it? And he also doesn't fear anybody. He's not in fear of anybody. When we come back, we'll look at what Hamlet's really about. 20-minute break. Come back at 5 past.
Where were you looking?
Not really that long ago.
Next week, we've got Nietzsche, The Birth of Tragedy, which is the core text in this subject. It's in the book, in the bookshop, in the library. Probably find it online in different forms. It was written in German. Recent translate, there were 1900, there are 100-year ago translations. I wouldn't bother with them because the English is sort of archaic, quaint, and the book's hard enough without reading it in sort of antiquated English. But any of the translations the last 30 or 40 years are fine. Doesn't really matter. They've got different ones, have got different strengths and weaknesses. This is Nietzsche, The Birth of Tragedy. There's a lot of reference to Greek, classical Greek mythology, figures, myths. You'll need some sort of reference work. These days you can Google any of this sort of stuff. Those of you who prefer book form, that's an excellent reference book, Hall's Dictionary of Subjects and Symbols in Art. Quick reference to who was Agamemnon, who was Demeter, Artemis, so on and so forth, which you'll need as you're reading the text, otherwise some of it will be very difficult to understand. You'll need, there are hundreds of encyclopedias of Greek mythology, so if you've got one of those at home, it's fine. But you will need some sort of secondary reference. Google might be just as quick as anything these days. The other great book on classical Greece, or classical Greek culture, is Roberto Colasso's The Marriage of Cadmus. And for those of you who are interested, The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony. You're going to have enough trouble handling Nietzsche in the next week, but I'll just throw this in. It has a real feel for classical Greek mythology and culture, which is really the foundation of the West, foundation of Western culture, as Nietzsche will be arguing next week. Now let me just say again, Nietzsche is very difficult, and if you don't find it difficult, there's something wrong. You'll be moaning and complaining and whinging and cursing. Most students who finish this course end up loving Nietzsche, but you won't believe that. You'll think that's some sort of neurosis, some sort of masochism in the next week. Those of you, which will be almost all of you, haven't read the text before. And it's not particularly systematic, which doesn't help. So you're just going to make the best of it you can. We'll spend 3 hours next week trying to clarify Nietzsche's argument. By the end of next Monday, it should be a lot clearer. And as I said, central to this course is it's the theory of culture this course is based on, basically. It's the most powerful theory of culture that exists, Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy, next week. We'll be coming back to it again and again in further discussions. The voluntary tutorials start this week, Wednesday, 11 o'clock in my room. Anyone who wants extra discussion, 11 o'clock in my room this week, this Wednesday. The voluntary. Let me just reinforce, it should be pretty obvious to you by now, there's no point in coming to these Monday morning sessions unless you've done the reading, and done the reading carefully. This is basically going to be a seminar like today, like last week, on the reading. This will be particularly true next week. So this is a course you actually can't do unless you do the reading and do it carefully. And you're going to really, the essays are going to be impossible if you haven't done the reading and done it carefully. It'll just be impossible. You're better off not to even bother writing them. Just have a fantasy or a virtual fail. We can see from the numbers today how the numbers have diminished. Well, that means there are lots of students not doing the reading. This is a university, it's on their heads. But this is a course where you really can't avoid the reading. All right, any more questions on admin? Texts? Before we go back to Hamlet? With any, I mean, this course really centres on 10 stories. This is our third story, Hamlet. In any story, there's usually a climax or a series of climaxes, or main lines. We're going to look at paintings in a couple of weeks' time. Main lines of force in the painting. Where in Hamlet, where's the? It's not obvious. Sometimes there isn't an obvious climax. There are a few. What's the climax to the story?
It's when he confronts his mother.
Right, the mirror in front of his mother. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the climax doesn't have to be at the end. All the sword fighting at the end is almost certainly not the climax of this story.
I reckon the play when he figures out that Claudius is actually like guilty.
Right, the play when it becomes clear to Hamlet that Claudius is guilty is the two very powerful impression points. The mirror before the mother. This is sort of really underlining the mother-son reading. The play, the exposure of Claudius. Any other?
What about when he kills the guy through the curtain? I can't remember his name. And he realises that, that's when he realises he needs to kill Claudius. He's killed someone else, and that was his decision. He's like, I'm killing Polonius. Oh no, I didn't. But that was his realisation that he needed.
Maybe, although it should have happened earlier, that realisation. And Polonius is only a minor figure.
His death has major. It basically changes the way the story goes.
The death of Polonius.
Yeah, because Hamlet now has to leave, and then everything just.
So he's got blood on his hands. Death rises that moment. Okay, we've got a third possible climax. When you read the story, have any of you seen the play live?
Mm.
What was the sort of climactic? There wasn't.
That was too long ago.
Too long ago, yeah. And the film versions?
Oh.
Yeah.
I don't know, I'm just looking at this soliloquy that he ends, his final soliloquy where he ends, oh, from this time forth my thoughts be bloody or be nothing worth. So is that where he finally resolves that he is going to take action and kill Claudius? That's after he sees Fortinbras.
He gets into a duel with Laertes though, and then it happens.
Okay.
Not really. If you do watch Hamlet, the full play goes for about 4 hours. It's pretty grueling. In that time, the one period in which the play the mood changes is in the gravedigger scene at the start of Act 5, where there's a lot of wit and joking and cracking of skulls. The mood sort of lightens or lifts. That scene centres on jokes about death. We're back with the death theme, but it focuses on. We've already mentioned it. Really, the skull of Yorick, the court jester. Explicit death image. And Hamlet speaks the most affectionate words in the whole play when he addresses the skull. Alas, poor Yorick, this is 5:180. I knew him, Horatio, a fellow of infinite jest and most excellent fancy. He hath bore me on his back 1,000 times, when Hamlet was a boy. And now how abhorred in my imagination it is. My gorge rises at it. Here hung those lips that I have kissed. I know not how. Where be your jibes now, your gambols, your songs, your flashes of merriment that were wont to set the table on a roar? Alas, poor Yorick. There's a warmth and affection here in his reminiscing as a boyhood with the court jester, although he's holding the skull, long dead, of the court jester. He's conversing with death here. What's the first key encounter in the play? The first really significant encounter.
Hamlet and the Ghost.
Yeah, Hamlet and the Ghost. The ghost itself is death, isn't it? And Hamlet, we've talked about oaths in this course. Hamlet swears an oath to the ghost. Remember me.
I was wondering perhaps if that oath, his hesitation perhaps, is his recognition that with the death of Claudius it will be the death of him as well. And I think the doubt and not confusion, but the reluctance signifies that it's his reluctance, that he knows that it will be the end of him.
Why didn't he just kill Claudius and become king? That's the general assumption through the text.
But you're talking about the encounter with
the ghost at the beginning. Yeah.
So that oath, it was his recognition that he will die with Claudius.
No, because it's his father's ghost. If he follows his father's advice, he'll avenge his father's death by killing Claudius, and then Hamlet will become king. There's nothing in the speech there suggesting that Hamlet himself will die.
Why didn't Hamlet become king immediately after his father's death? I always assumed that Gertrude was the one that was the royal heir, and that her husband, the king who's the ghost, was the consort.
No.
Because otherwise Hamlet should have the throne because he's 30.
It's ambiguous. I mean, that's one of the ambiguities in the play, and the people are unhappy about. Claudius is the implication is sort of seized the throne. I mean, he is the king's brother. Hamlet was away, and Claudius has sort of seized the throne, but he's sort of semi-legitimate, and especially marrying Gertrude makes it even more legitimate. But there is ambiguity around Claudius's legitimacy as king. It's certainly true. Which is further reason why Hamlet kills Claudius, becomes king. No doubt about that. The ghost's actually not saying kill Claudius in order to become king, but he's saying kill Claudius in order to avenge me. Now that sets the terms for the rest of the play, doesn't it? The oath. Again, talking about the importance of an oath in culture 2 weeks ago. Hamlet's oath is to the ghost, remember me. And then the ghost has to reappear later on. Scene with one of the scenes with his mother to urge him on. We get an oath early on, Hamlet with ghost, death, father's ghost, death. We've got this very love, almost attachment to the skull, court jester at the start of Act 5. What about Hamlet's dying? He talks to Horatio. Horatio wants to kill himself. Hamlet's words to Horatio. You remember his reference to death? Horatio wants to kill himself. Hamlet's response. 5 to about 3:40. Absent thee from felicity a while. Absent thee from felicity a while. He associates death with happiness, felicity. Don't kill yourself now, because I want you to go and tell my story. Absent thee from felicity a while. We've got Hamlet with the skull. It's almost like he's in love with death. Also, if you go through the play, we talk a lot about Hamlet's concern with why he lacks passion, but probably the other main theme in all his speeches is death. He talks a lot about death. The to be or not to be speech, famous speech in English probably. It's not about being, to be or not to be. You think it's about the nature of being. Who am I? Self-identity. No, it's about suicide. Reread it. The speech is entirely about suicide. Whether I should kill myself. the identity question, to be or not to be, really relates to suicide. And you'll see in Nietzsche next week, Nietzsche plays upon the to be or not to be. And he has a reading of Hamlet, a very interesting reading of Hamlet, in Birth of Tragedy. Hamlet kills Polonius. They're all trying to find where the body is. What's Hamlet's response?
He makes jokes about it.
He makes jokes, yeah, about maggots.
Follow your nose.
Follow your nose, there'll be a smell under the stairs very soon. Just makes jokes about it. Like he has no bad conscience whatsoever about killing Polonius. And, you know, he regards Polonius as an old fool. But there's no reason for killing him. Polonius is not entirely an old fool anyway. He gives very good advice to his son. Polonius is a mixed figure. Probably makes us think that Hamlet's father was a mixed figure, and Claudius too is a mixed figure, not pure good, pure evil. So this is rather morbid imagination about maggots and the stench of corpses, and I mean that sociopath reading has some cogency here too. The normal human response would be, you know, feeling pretty bad that I've killed an innocent man. Hamlet doesn't even blink, sort of laughs about it, turns it into a joke.
And it's even stranger when you consider, you know, Laertes is a good friend of his, and Ophelia was his girlfriend, and it's their father that he's just killed, but he's absolutely no qualms about it.
No qualms about it at all. So if we take the opening meeting with the ghost, the oath with death, and the skull at the end, and look at the references to death throughout, and there are lots of other ones, I won't go through them all. And absently from felicity a while, happiness, to be or not to be speech is all about suicide, killing himself. Hamlet's main attachment here is to death. It's a sort of death worship going on. They go too far. It's a very strange reading, but that's what the text seems to say. Ethan makes his oath to his niece Debbie. Hamlet makes his oath to death. He becomes a sort of prince of death.
You could argue that his liking of death or fascination with it is part of his depression.
Yes.
You know, he has those suicidal tendencies and desires.
The two certainly go together.
Yeah.
Which is first and which is second, or whether they interrelate, yes, absolutely.
So I don't think he's depressed. He's too active and he knows what he's doing. When you're depressed, you have no idea what's going on.
He's not chronically depressed.
It's all different sorts of depression.
He just doesn't display, typical symptoms of that level of depression.
He's walking around talking to himself, thinking about things, and actually acting from time to time is not a sign of acute depression.
He's still feeling things, and he's living. It's just
and he's also outraged at himself with my inability to act. There's some plausibility to that, isn't it? There is certainly some melancholy depression there, but maybe he's not as chronically depressed as we might have been suggesting. So the oath with death, strange. I mean, this is the most written about work in our culture, and yet somehow it's its ultimate end or driving force is death as happiness. If you see productions of Hamlet, and most of the films, Hamlet usually turns up on stage dressed in black, pale skin, sort of bohemian, melancholy, but you know, the associations are also with sort of black death imagery. When he talks about the end of the to be or not to be speech of the pale cast of thought, thinking, conscience. Pale cast, and again it's death. Pale, spectral, deathly. I mean, cultures normally focus themselves, not just West, the West, all cultures focus themselves on explanations for death, transcendence of death, like the cross, in Western culture, the cross, resurrection. Hamlet is really the obvious, the sort of antichrist, in that there's no transcendence of death. There is no meaning apart from death, the ultimate no, N-O. The last no. And if that is Hamlet, then why should he bother killing Claudius? You know, basically, my only passion, my only attachment is to death. Why bother? I mean, you don't need Freudian readings about fathers and mothers. You know, this is Hamlet. Whatever's brought it about, why bother? He has some feeling towards his mother. He puts the mirror up in front of her, wants her to be honest. It's true, there's some action there. What does he ask Horatio to do at the end, apart from not to kill himself immediately?
Tell his story.
Tell my story. Okay, what's going on?
So a Spartan, it reminds me of 300, how in the end the man, that one guy doesn't die and he's to spread the story.
Tell the story.
Yeah.
That's a sort of very noble story, though. Is this a noble story?
He thinks it is.
Hamlet, does Hamlet think?
No.
You know, basically Hamlet thought, oh, his only happiness is death. What's the point in telling my story?
Is it his happiness or is it just his resolve? He's just resolved himself. There's so much betrayal and so much. And I don't know, he's just like, this is.
Then finally
that's kind of his depression. He's given up and gone, you know, it's hopeless.
It's funny to use the word felicity, happiness, in relation to death.
Well, maybe that releases him then, doesn't it? It's the only thing that will release him. Because he is, you know, thinking constantly about this and about his decisions and actions. And I don't know where he actually really...
He does want to be released from all of that.
Yeah.
To be or not to be. He wants not to be.
Yeah.
He chooses not to be.
I don't know, I tend
Which I suppose is a classic suicidal depressive response. Just
but I still
end
think
the misery.
he wishes, maybe, I don't know, I think he's actually quite noble in some ways, and I think he actually maybe wants it to be different, and he knows that that's never going to happen. So he moves towards death closer instead of, you know.
So what he
accepts it.
fantasises is a story about Hamlet, which is actually not the one I know. What's the point in telling this story? It's so pessimistic and negative.
Well, stories can be sort of a form of immortality if you take it that way. But telling a story, you never really forget the people.
So in spite of everything that happens, Hamlet wants to be a sort of immortality of my story, which of course happens. Possibly.
I thought he wanted his story told as a warning to others
Maybe.
to sort of show, look,
Don't be like me.
yeah, you know, this happened and that happened, we all ended up dead. if we had done it differently, maybe.
Maybe.
It would
Tell my story, so it's
different
warning.
outcome.
Yeah, I'm not asking for peaches and cream endings here. I'm just, you know.
Because I mean, that's what I'm just reading here. What Horatio says at the end to Fortinbras. He sort of talks about, and let me speak to the yet unknowing world how these things came about. So shall you hear of carnal, bloody and unnatural acts, of accidental judgments, casual slaughters, of deaths put on by cunning and forced cause, and in this upshot purposes mistook. So he's sort of talking about all these things that went wrong because people were deceitful and all the rest of it.
It could be about truth, because you know, it's saying that he's telling the truth, and he's always been big on truth with.
Does he really
everyone.
believe? What does he believe in truth? What does Hamlet believe in apart from death as happiness?
Well, he keeps trying to he keeps saying to people, "Don't deceive me," and he points out the deception.
Yes, he does.
So truth's obviously important.
Yeah, he doesn't like betrayal.
Yeah,
But he sort of knows the truth about Claudius very early on. He can't do anything with it.
He doesn't like people betraying him, but he's happy to betray people and lie to them and act the fool and trick people into stuff. So.
Who does he betray?
Well, I mean, I guess he doesn't really have any. I mean, he betrays Ophelia. I
Yes,
think.
he does. Yeah, and he's got that. He's got blood on his hands with Ophelia.
And Rosencrantz and Guildenstern.
Yeah, but I suppose in his own mind they deserve it because they betrayed him. I don't think he'd have too much bad conscience about them.
I think he doesn't do anything at the beginning. It's always as a reaction to something else they've done. So they've betrayed at some point in the past.
Yeah. The moment they've betrayed him, and the same's true with Ophelia, that's it. You're cut. You know, it's someone who has no forgiveness, absolutely no forgiveness for betrayal. It's very, very sensitive to that.
But there's two sort of, just reminded me, one of the play I saw of Shakespeare many years ago, the stage was set up, and one side I think was red and black, and the other side was green or something, and they would stand on the particular side of the stage depending on what sort of philosophy. So if they were going with the more Old Testament vengeance, eye for an eye, they would stand on the black and red half of the stage. If they were more sort of about forgiveness, it would be the other side. So, and that whole thing with betrayal, it's like, yeah, he was betrayed by Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, but it's how do you react to that? It's sort of pretty harsh to say, yeah, I'll kill them because they betrayed me. Do you just forgive them? Which is in a more New Testament Christian sense.
In their case, though, they were sending him to his death.
But they didn't know that.
I think it's implied that they did. They knew what they were carrying.
I didn't think they did.
Well, certainly his reaction to Ophelia is extreme. Now he jumps into Ophelia's grave, and another death scene, a death image at the end of that grave diggers. He comes across the burial of Ophelia, and he jumps into her grave, you know, as if to be buried with her, and says, you know, 40,000 brothers couldn't love her as much as I do, which, you know, is ridiculous in the
40,000 brothers with all their summer love.
Yeah, which, you know, given his behaviour, is ludicrous.
It's almost like he had to have a one-upmanship with Laertes. It's like you're grieving for your sister, but it's nothing compared to me.
Compared to my grief.
Yeah, even though I was calling her a whore 5 minutes ago and made her kill herself.
Yeah, even though I'm a major cause for what's happened to her. And he says, this is I, Hamlet the Dane. And everyone realises Hamlet, rather bombastic and sort of showy, to try hard in modern slang in this scene. So you sort of, we get the sense of him unhinged in relation to death in this scene. Or maybe his conscience in relation to Ophelia is coming out there.
It is a very poignant scene though. Always brings a tear to my eye.
Well, it's almost like the death of a child, the death of Ophelia. It's got that sort of association.
And I think when you see it performed, it probably depends on the version, but you know, he says it with such anguish and such passion that you do sort of believe he's genuine at that point in his emotions, even though, like as I said, you might just question it later and go, hang on, he's just one-upping Laertes at that time when you see it performed. It's just it's like, wow, this is, you know, he's really feeling that.
Which reflects if anything he's slightly unhinged. His unhinged nature.
Inconstant.
Pale cast of thought, we're back with that. Thinking is thinking deathly. This is one of the images in this play. Absolutely the opposite of last week. It'll be more prominent next week when we come to Nietzsche. Nietzsche will be much more sympathetic to this view of thinking than Socrates' view. The pale cast of thought.
His purpose, though, for thinking was not the Socrates' purpose. In Socrates, you are to think, to judge yourself and the situation. So you have a judgmental eye, like you're criticizing the situation.
Yes.
But in this play, thinking is used as procrastination. He's not thinking of how to best act. He's thinking reasons to not act instead. His thinking is limiting
For
his action.
excuses.
Yeah.
For excuses. Is that entirely true? I mean, certainly true of a lot of Hamlet's thinking, finding excuses why he can't act. Is he also trying to find motives, sort of psychological analysis, which Socrates is not interested in? I mean, Hamlet's a bit like a modern patient, a counsellor with psychotherapy. He wants to know, why can't I act? Tell me the reasons. Then Freud and others then respond to his neurosis, if you want to call it that, his paralysis. It's also, this is somewhat modern, this sort of interest in myself and my motives. Why am I not happy? And then surely thinking, self-analysis will help me. The play Hamlet, if anything, has the opposite message. It won't do you any good at all. Shakespeare's also playing with will, the sort of the nature of free will. He says, as I said, he's writing at a time in which there's great belief in free will, that what gives us dignity as humans is our freedom of will to act, like Socrates says. This is what Hamlet lacks. There's a bit of coding inside in one of his chats with Polonius. Polonius says he was in a play when he was young. He played Julius Caesar. Shakespeare writes a play of Julius Caesar. Brutus stabbed him in the play of Julius Caesar. In historical truth, Brutus assassinates Julius Caesar. And here it's Hamlet who assassinates Polonius or kills Polonius. There's a sort of association of Brutus and Hamlet. In Shakespeare's play of Julius Caesar, Brutus is much more a man of action than Hamlet. It's a sort of, and he acts on his will. Brutus says, well, Caesar's becoming corrupt. Caesar's a friend of mine. He's been a good leader, but he's becoming corrupt for the sake of himself and the sake of Rome. I'm going to kill him. He does kill him. Hamlet has, actually, Brutus doesn't have very good reasons for killing Julius Caesar, and Shakespeare's play is all about that. Hamlet has very good reasons for killing Claudius and still can't do it. So there's again this, if we're looking at the reasons for the popularity of Hamlet, there was this thing of the modern...
He's his own worst enemy.
He's his own worst enemy.
Which is a really common human condition that we all are.
Especially in modern condition.
Yeah.
Why can't I do? Why can't I act? Why can't I do what I know I should do? You know, your first essay in this course, why can't I get up at 8 o'clock in the morning and do 8 hours work today on it? You just can't bring yourself to do it. Hamlet. My sensible self, my rational self, my willing self wants to do that. But I then go and fritter away the whole day, making excuses. I'm too tired. My boyfriend's been treating me badly. Friends are hounding me. I need something to eat. I need more chocolate. excuse after excuse after excuse, the whole day's gone. Hamlet. Procrastination. The suggestion is it's a disease of more complicated, self-reflective natures like Hamlet. Not Laertes doesn't have this problem, doesn't reflect enough. But a typical admirable modern individual reflects, is insightful, sensitive, and therefore is much more likely to suffer from procrastination. Is much more likely to suffer from not being able to act, or not being able to do the right thing even. Now, this is a problem you don't see in Socrates. Socrates is not aware of this problem. Then you get the contemporary, if only I'd done that, or if only I'd worked harder in year 12, if only I'd been a different person than the one I am. And Hamlet's sort of, if only I wasn't Hamlet, or if only I was Fortinbras, or if only I was Alexander the Great. But that's linked with a preoccupation with death. His last image of Alexander the Great is Alexander the Great is dead, he's rotted away, he's dust, the dust from his body is a bung sealing a beer cask. The absurdity of life. This is in this too, that if you think about things too much, everything seems absurd. So what's the point? Washed up by the killing Claudius. So where does that leave us?
I think that even if you kill Claudius, it doesn't show any heroism. Other figures like King Alexander or Spartan, or if they kill somebody, it shows the sort of heroism everyone upholds and give him that sort of recognition. But for Hamlet, it seemed to me that even if he killed Claudius, he wouldn't get the recognition or the heroism that he wanted to receive. It's more like sort of his impulse to want to kill because of his own psychological, not disorder, but trouble in his troubled mind, I would say. And it's sort of epitome of linked to a firstborn child, like the only child in the family, where the firstborn or the only child gets most of the attention all the time, and when the attention shifts to another person, then the jealousy sort of comes out and doesn't know how to react because the person has never in his life or her life have to react or have to deal with jealousy before.
Yeah, so on top of the Oedipus complex, there's the problem of the only spoiled only child. And
that's what I know.
There's no suggestion that Hamlet's got brothers or sisters. And maybe one reason for his extreme attachment to his mother, that he's never had competition with a brother or a sister. That's true. I mean, he has had competition with his father. That's the weather. Ghosts appearing. But the reality in family, just to continue that, but into modern families, is it's not uncommon for fathers to be very hostile to sons rather than the other way around, because mother's affection and love shifts to son when son's born, and away from father. So this is a variant on Freud's Oedipus complex of the sort of hostility or hatred of fathers towards sons, or fathers in competition with sons over. So it's not only the hatred from the son to the father, it can be the other way around. Whether it probably wouldn't be very heroic in Hamlet, to get back to where you started, for Hamlet to kill Claudius, it probably wouldn't, in his eyes, be a particularly heroic act. Just something that he should do. Does Hamlet want to be a hero? Do you view him is he going back with the ego title? Is Hamlet so full of himself he wants to be the modern hero? This is pretty sordid, killing his uncle.
If he wanted to be the hero, we would just kill him straight out. He would just, he would have already done it. He's using it for glory, for the, yeah, look what I did kind of thing. He was more, deciding on whether that was the right thing to do. He knew Claudius killed his father, but he was like, I need to kill him, but do I actually need to kill him? And he was,
Well, he does. He thinks it is the right thing to do. Yeah. He's got that, but for some reason he's paralysed.
Is this something to do with the fact that that sort of becomes his quest? And
What becomes his quest?
Killing
Claudius.
and thinking about it and obsessing over death whilst he's doing this. And once he kills him, the quest is over.
Yeah, and he dies. But it's all pretty futile because everyone's dead. His mother's dead. Maeonius is dead. Everyone's dead. Ophelia's dead. So what's, at that point he hasn't saved Denmark.
No.
He's wrecked Denmark. He's dithering around. His inability to act on his will has led to chaos.
He single-handedly destroyed the entire royal family.
Single-handedly destroyed the whole royal family. And foreigner comes in and takes over.
He was like, sweet, free castle, free.
That's right.
The whole quest thing that you're just talking about is very similar to Ethan's quest and how it ends. And then he's got no purpose. So it's like death is freedom because without death, he lives a life of emptiness.
This is Hamlet or this is Ethan?
Well, kind of both.
But Ethan has restored order and he's delivered Debbie back into the community. And the old man's got his rocking chair, marriages are happening. That's very, very different.
Yeah, but perhaps that's why Hamlet isn't a hero. Because he hasn't been able to restore order.
Yes, he's not a hero. He's not a tragic hero in the traditional sense at all. And Hamlet's this play is usually regarded as tragedy. There's a big question mark whether it is, whether it's not just a melodrama. Because, where's the dignity at the end? In Greek tragedy, the hero is in very difficult, male or female, Antigone and some others, are in a very difficult situation and they have to restore order. Often it involves them losing their own lives. But there's a sense of a higher order over things which is damaged and then, as in the Searchers, then gets restored. Whereas in Hamlet, there's no. Is there any order beyond? Is there any God? Is there any...
You could say it's a tragedy in that it's all futile, like they all die.
It's tragic in that sense, but it's not tragic in the grand sense of Greek tragedy. We'll be looking at next week, the grand sense of Greek tragedy. It's not uplifting. There's nothing uplifting about the ending of Hamlet. The weather doesn't like Hamlet. Interesting play. Are you sort of sick of it? It's got a lot of attention. It gets reworked and reworked and reworked. We'll be looking at Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. There's a lot of Hamlet in that. In very influential modern films. Fight Club. We'll be looking at watching Fight Club. Many of you know Fight Club. There's a lot of Hamlet in Fight Club. This is a story that doesn't go away. Comes with rewritten, reflected upon the novels of Dostoevsky are full of Hamlet, the Hamlet question.
What's your favourite film version of Hamlet?
It's a very difficult question. I don't think I've got one.
Okay. I like Kenneth Branagh's version.
Yeah, I like that one. It's a Russian one from 30 years ago. Not Laurence Olivier, I think he's wooden. Mel Gibson's not bad, actually. I wouldn't say it's my favourite, but he's not bad.
He's too active, he's running around all over the place.
The Monty Python one I come across on YouTube. It was Hamlet was in like a psychiatrist's office, and then there was a psychiatrist who not an actual psychiatrist, and another one who wasn't a psychiatrist, and it was a running joke. It goes about 5 minutes. It's pretty funny if you're a Monty Python fan. Yeah.
Anyone else know that? I like Brian, the script on the Jesus story. It's very good. Sopranos plays quite a bit on the Hamlet. And Tony's constantly confronted with death absurdity. Though most people who know Sopranos. So the questions raised here reverberate through the Sopranos. Oh, it seems very unlikely because the mafia boss, the setting's quite different. But Nietzsche's certainly important to the Sopranos. He's quoted. All right, I think we might end there for today and pardon the dreadful weather.
Yeah.